Hi, guys. Welcome to A Little Help for Our Friends, a podcast for people with loved ones struggling with mental health. Hey, little helpers. It's Dr. Kibbe here. Before we dive into this episode, I wanted to tell you how I could help you navigate the mental health or addiction struggles of the people you love. Cool of Mine is the online coaching platform and community that I built to support you in the moment when you need it the most, like having hard conversations, asserting your needs, or setting boundaries. Even if you're just curious and want to chat about it, book a free call with me by going to the link in the show notes or going to coolamind.com, KULAMIND.com, and click Get Started. Thank you and enjoy the show. Hello, little helpers. So, this episode is a conversation with Eric Lin, who directed the movie Rosemead. And this is the third and last episode in what turned out to be a series of conversations with the cast and crew of Rosemead. Last episode, we had Lauren Shou, who's the star, and a couple weeks ago, we had Ansi De Benedetto, another actor in it. And I am so glad we had such an in-depth exploration of this movie that honestly, I've never seen anything like it before. I've never seen a movie that tackled mental health like it before, that took on a really difficult and brave story. And actually, let me do it justice by reading the official description of the movie. So, Rosemead is inspired by the harrowing true story. Lucy Liu transforms in a riveting, career-defining performance as an ailing woman who takes drastic measures to protect her troubled teenage son, played by Lauren Shou. And as his dark obsessions grow and time runs out, she is forced to make impossible choices. How far will she go, and what is she willing to sacrifice? Set against the simmering tensions of a Chinese American community, Rosemead is a gripping portrait of a family pushed to the edge. Whew, okay, well, that was a pretty accurate description. And I sat down with Eric to talk about how he was able to create such an authentic depiction of schizophrenia. I mean, it was so realistic and yet so relatable, which is a really hard balance to strike, and he did it. And I just found it fascinating to talk to him about how it's a really unique story, right? A Chinese immigrant mother and a son with schizophrenia. I mean, you would think that this is super rare, no one could relate, but he told the story in a way where a lot of people can end up relating to it, right? Like people, at least in the screening that I was in, people related to how hard it is for parents to deal with kids with severe mental illness, and other people related to feeling the cost of cultural stigma around mental health. And so I was just really struck by how thoughtfully Eric brought this story to life and is sparking a really important conversation across the country. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and go see Rosemead out in theaters January 9th. Welcome back, little helpers. We have a special guest today. It's Eric Lin, who's the director of the movie that I've been raving about, Rosemead. I'm just so, Eric, thank you so much for coming. I've been dying to talk to you. We had Ansi and Lawrence, the actors of the movie, on previous episodes, and they raved about you. So I was like, I gotta talk to him. I gotta have him on the podcast. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about. I mean, I love hearing the different descriptions of Rosemead. So tell me
Hmm.
about how you thought of this movie. How would you describe it? And yeah, just tell us about the movie.
Sure. Lucy Liu plays a terminally ill woman who uncovers her son's growing obsession with mass violence. And it's sort of about a mother's love pushed to its edge, pushed to its limits as she sort of grapples with what that, what it means.
Yeah, and I didn't even know this, but is this your feature debut as a director, or that's what Lawrence was saying?
Yeah, it is. It's my first feature. I've shot a lot of features as a cinematographer, but it's my first feature directing. Yeah. So, I could have chose an easier story, but to be honest, it was a story that was very personal to me, and something that I felt so deeply connected with, and that's what really drew me to want to direct it. And yeah.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. You did an amazing job.
Oh, thank you.
So congratulations on like kind of a banger of a debut. So
Thanks.
So yeah, this podcast and our audience is this is Rosemead is such an important movie for especially our community because we talk about how mental illness affects the family and our loved ones, and we really like to talk about how mental illness is. We I think our healthcare system talks about it like it's one person who's sick, but we know that it affects the community, it affects everyone around them, right? So that this movie shows that perfectly how does a family navigate illnesses of all types. What about this? And with your Q&A, it sounded like it really was like a labor of love, like this was a very important story to you. So tell me a little bit about when you say that this is something that called to you, that this was like, something that mattered to you. Why was this story?
Yeah, I've have friends and families who've struggled with their mental health, and I've seen how the sort of I when I read the script and the article, I could really see how like the shame and the isolation that came from that shame, operated, and I could understand why, Irene made the decision she did, and it was so heartbreaking to me. I saw my own family in that story. There's these elements of like, you know, um, the inclination or the desire to spare the people you love, pain, and so you lie to them, or you don't tell them the whole truth. These are dynamics I saw in my own family. I grew up in Southern California in the suburbs, but my parents are immigrants from Taiwan, and so I already saw sort of like the roots of their behavior, and I could understand like Irene's narrative logic and the emotional place that she felt like that she had to be at, to feel like she had to do what she did. And it was so heartbreaking to me because of that, the isolation she had, immigrant families especially, lacking the support and the language to kind of find help or find resources. Um, and and also similarly Joe's story where he's trying to prove to his mom that he's strong enough to go back to school, even though his symptoms are getting more extreme, or um, he wants to show that he can be as strong and make her proud, and so for me that like those that those emotions being sort of at the root of the story just made it all the more heartbreaking to me, and I felt like it was an urgent story, that needed to be told. Like we've never seen anything like this on screen before. A story about an immigrant family dealing with someone who has mental illness, and what it does to a family, and especially this their story is just so tragic, and it just makes more extreme kind of the circumstances, and the all the sort of isolation and helplessness that they feel, and the fear that all that gets augmented through that lens. And so it was something that I felt like had to be told, and but in the end it took us 7 years to tell it.
That's crazy. So how did the story come across your like did you find the script 7 years ago? What was the process of going from finding it to making it?
So Minette Louis, let me start further back. We There was Theo James and Andrew Corkin were two of our producers who had optioned the article. They had read the LA Times article by Frank Xiong, and it stayed with them. They're not Asian American, but they read this story and it sort of haunted them. And so they were trying to figure out, like, is it a documentary? Is it a feature? But it was a story they wanted to tell. And so they ended up pairing up with or working with Minette Louis, a producer that I know. And Minette's been in the indie world a long time. She's a great producer. She's done a lot of incredible films that deal with difficult topics. And she brought on Marilyn Fu, who adapted the article into the screenplay. And so once they sort of had the screenplay in shape, they started looking for directors. And I had worked with Minette on several features as a cinematographer. We had worked together a bunch, and we talked about working on projects. And again, I wasn't looking to direct, but luckily Minette thought of me, and I read the script, and she just said, is this something you might be interested in, and they were talking to a lot of directors who were all sort of pitching on the project. And again, I just felt like I connected to the story so deeply. that I just told them my perspective and my history, and I grew up in Southern California. We went to Monterey Park and Rosemead and Alhambra like every weekend. My parents would drag us there for shopping and restaurants and food, and so I had like a sense memory of that world. So even though I live in New York now, I grew up in that environment. So luckily, they took a leap of faith on me, and they said yes to me directing. Yeah,
I, you're saying that the article was haunting. That's definitely something that you were able to create with a movie because it definitely haunted me. I mean,
mm.
my husband and I didn't even know what it was really about. My
Okay,
husband thought it was like about like immigration and like the struggles of, like a mother who was like first generation, right? Like there was something about that, but then we just like were slack jawed for the last like few minutes of it, and we think about it every once in a while. So it really, it really is it's a haunting story because
yeah,
there's no clear right or wrong. There's no clear villain, right? There's not there. It doesn't. You don't come out being like, good guys won and the bad guys. It's
yeah.
just was like, this is life and this is a tragedy, and it was, oh wow. So I just can go on and on. So tell us a little bit about when you were talking about mental illness or illness in families and like talk about it, kind of hide it. How I mean, my mom is from Hong Kong, so I have a similar experience. But how do you understand how maybe Asian immigrants, Chinese immigrants, or any different groups will kind of treat mental illness and illness and help and other
Yeah,
kinds of illness?
yeah. I mean, I think it's definitely not just mental illness. Um, for instance, like I grew up in Thousand Oaks, just like suburb of LA,
Mm,
and there weren't very many Taiwanese families there. So, whenever something happened, like my brother got in trouble a lot, it'd be like everybody's watching you, right? So everything you do is reflecting on our family. And so there's this very heightened awareness of, projecting a certain facade, of not showing vulnerability or weakness or, doing anything to bring shame. And, I feel like that, illness, especially is something like mental illness, which I don't know if, my parents necessarily had the vocabulary to think about it until, our generation, their kids sort of like started to bring it up to them, and so I think their instinct is to hide it or to protect, to close it off. And, so much of like the tension in the film is about Irene trying to prevent that knowledge of Joe's condition getting out, right? Like she's trying to close it off. She's trying to prevent her friends from knowing it, preventing, the school from sharing things with the law enforcement, and there's all these things that she's trying to prevent from happening for fear of it sort of tainting him or staining him, and I think that's part of that attitude of not understanding it and fearing it, and but she is someone who, to her credit, like she is someone who did seek help, for him, right? She took him to, it was through sort of, from my understanding in the actual case, it was through like the school's recommendations, like, oh, you should seek some sort of help for him. And she did that, but I think her idea of it still is that like it was like a cold or something, right? It's like if I do this, then it'll go away, right? If he's taking this medicine, then he'll get better, and then he'll be back to the way he was, And this expectation that he could be that, she talks about him continuing on to college and all these things. She still has these high hopes about him that don't include, this massive thing that's in his life now. And, I think like, sort of that lack of understanding and that fear of it, is sort of what drives that lack of understanding.
As you were talking, I just remember it's interesting. You're saying that even in where you grew up, it was like, oh, don't keep it all in, like don't act out because everyone will see. Because you just popped up a memory where that would be the case all the time when we were in Hong Kong, where
Hmm.
we're out on the streets and I'm like, oh, this is a big city, whatever, and they're like, be careful, don't things can look badly on our family if you don't behave. And I, being from New York, I was like, what, like,
Yeah.
be an individual. But it is interesting how illness is talked about as something that you keep in the family and keep quiet, what would be the risk of people finding out? Like, what if, let's say, in Rosemead, that little Chinese community, the friends that they had did find out what he had? What would happen to him? Like, what would be the risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, unfortunately, I think it's sort of like some of their own their own biases reflected back on them, like there's that little scene in the party where the moms are sort of gossiping about him and talking about how she saw him go into the treatment center. If they're giving him drugs and it's damaging his brains, and I think it's this fear of those kinds of stories, getting out and um again, it's like a fear of being vulnerable. It's a fear of, and also, I mean, not just fear though, too, because I think it's like a fear of burdening. Maybe that is a fear. It's like a fear of burdening other people, right? It's like if they actually shared, it's same similar thing. Is like if anyone ask you how you're doing and you had like a really bad day, and then you start to unload on them, I think it's all the more heightened, especially in Asian American communities where, if you share these things, then people don't know what to do with it. And in some cases they react, very badly and like they'll start to ostracize her or gossip about them or, I could imagine scenes where they wouldn't want their kids to hang out with Joe, and start to close off, I've seen it happen with my friends' families too. It's like when their child was struggling with mental health, they stop socializing, right? Because when families get together, all they do is talk about their kids, and they just stop, their entire like social circle basically. They shut themselves off from it. That's the tragedy, right? It's like there might have been people who would have understood. Kylie is open, even though her ideas about it are more rooted in like Eastern medicine, but she still wants to be there to help in whatever way she can. But again, Irene is like trying not to burden her, right? Because it's so massive. It's like how do you like how do you invite someone into all that, if they're not your direct family? Um, and I think that's the thing that was so heartbreaking is, I read this book, Zigzag Boy by Tanya Frank, where she talks about her son who has schizophrenia and like how she sort of like how she grappled with how to take care of him. And, that was really eye-opening reading that book in prep is just how how much you have to surround this person with help, right? It's like what it takes to really um, take care of a person like that who, especially if they're young, the brain chemistry is changing, medication might need to be adjusted constantly. Um, their conditions going through different, mutations, so they need a lot of monitoring and support. And especially in that book, she's a single parent. So it was really, eye-opening to me, like the amount of help that they needed, right? And the fear of asking for it is what's, prevented or, enabled the tragedy to happen. And, I think that for me is, yeah, just like one of the most tragic parts of it is like that inability to ask for help and inability to talk about it and not having that vocabulary to reach out and being able to find that support.
Yeah. I mean, bring in a really interesting point that I'm like reviewing the whole movie and seeing elements of it where I think a lot of people talk about stigma, like, as we're saying, I'm afraid of people thinking badly of us and, thinking it's our fault or whatever. But there's also this very Chinese and maybe just Asian in general, the communal, a collectivist approach of like, I just want to shine good things on the people around me, and I
Mhm.
don't want to be a burden.
Yeah.
That burden is like the fear of being a burden is interesting because it's also on the mother Irene's level where she was struggling with cancer.
Yeah.
She like was like taking herself to the treatments by herself and just kind of being this stereotypical like tough Chinese woman. It's like I'll take care of everything myself.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I mean it's like projecting that strength and like, yeah, not asking not asking for help and somehow um that's so ingrained and it feels like it's so ingrained in the culture and it's interesting though as we've been showing the film, people have been coming up like from all different kind of backgrounds and talking about how there's elements of the dynamics they see in the story that apply to their culture or their families or their lives, and you know, we made this film to be very hyper specific about, Chinese immigrant family in Southern California, but it was incredible to see that people from all sorts of backgrounds, ethnicities and cultures, take similar, could find similar things to latch onto in their own families and how they treat, yeah, everything, illness, mental illness, or shame.
Mhm. What have you heard? What have people?
Similar, I mean, it's very similar, but I think the dynamic is just in different ways. But it was about how people are afraid to talk about it, afraid to share. Like it's things they keep inside within the family. Um, and I think it just, the way the behavior kind of comes out or manifests is different in each culture, depending on sort of like their lens. But it was interesting that they also felt it. It wasn't just like, oh wow, that's like, an Asian American thing. That's wild. No, it's like, oh, we have that thing in African American cultures too, or in
Mhm.
Latino cultures. But we do it, they might manifest in a different way, but it is, at the root of it.
I was struck by what Lawrence was saying that he was so complimentary of you, saying that you really
Oh.
took care of, like, you really created a great atmosphere and great working environment, and really, you did a lot of research and really like thoughtfully portrayed schizophrenia specifically. What was your process of like learning about schizophrenia and how to direct somebody to show that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it being Lawrence's first feature and a pretty challenging role. When we cast him, that was one of my concerns was like, can he as an actor, do this thing, but you know, be intact as a human? Because we were gonna put him through a lot, and he'd have to go generate all these emotions and all this torment, and it was a concern of ours. So we were always, me and Lucy were always sort of checking on him and making sure that he was okay and that he had time after these scenes to decompress and talk about how he was. Um, because it was, I've done films with actors who had, as a cinematographer, I've done films where they've had to go through pretty extreme places, and some new actors, they generate all these things, and if they maybe don't have the tools, they don't know where to put it. After a scene, you do a massive scene, and you just like, where do I put all these things that are generated inside for the camera? But now the scene's over. What do I do with all this stuff? Um, so that was something we were always like cognizant of when we were, shooting is like, even though we were like super fast schedule, like I had to make, for me, I had to make sure that Lawrence, as he was going through like psychotic episodes or, these scenes with extreme fear, that he, afterwards he had a place to put it, or, even if it was just like joking or, just something to check in on him, that it wasn't just like, all right, we gotta move on to the next setup. Um, but we did a lot of research in terms of what schizophrenia could be like. What's been amazing to me is that on YouTube, there's a lot of people with schizophrenia filming their psychotic episodes to sort of demystify the process or what it is, and yet some more sort of extreme people with more extreme cases of schizophrenia, they have like motion detectors, so if they go into a psychotic episode, it triggers, and then they'll share that footage. But some people which is sort of more on the level that we thought Joe would be at, are they sort of are can feel like an episode coming on, and they'll start to describe it. They're like, oh, I'm sensing someone in that corner, or I'm starting to hear, this auditory hallucination or this, and this voice is now coming in, so they're struggling to stay present, which was like a real lesson for us. It's like because I think it was important for us that the audience root for Joe. If he just had like an extreme case of schizophrenia and anytime he had an episode, he was just gone to the world, then the audience wouldn't have anything to hold on to. And so when we discovered that there were people who had, I'm sure I mean, it's a spectrum, but we want to make sure that Joe was sort of in the portion of the spectrum where he was struggling to stay present, and he feels the torment, and there's all these things from his past that are coming up, but he's trying to stay present, he's trying to project and trying to be strong. And if we see that effort, then we knew that like the audience could feel that too. But we wanted to make those psychotic episodes as sort of like legible and tangible, but emotionally rooted as possible. for Joe or for Lawrence as an actor, but also yeah for the audience because I think they would they can see his terror and his torment if we make it understandable through Lawrence's performance. So we watched there's some BBC documentary, I think it's called Don't Call Me Crazy, um, where it was amazing because they followed these kids that were in a psych ward in Britain. I can't remember what city, but they allowed a film crew there. And so, there's these kids, some of them had schizophrenia, some of them had other conditions. But there were several cases of people with schizophrenia who would, describe their either psychosis and what they saw when they had psychotic episodes, what they felt. And, what was also clear was sort of that even though they would hear things like voices or, competing voices or many conversations in their mind, um, what they talked about too was that there would be like a feeling of doom, right? Or fear or paranoia or something. There was like an emotion attached to it that wasn't just like the content of the words, right? And so for us, it was like, how do you make that? How do you give that feeling of doom when he's like walking down the hallway at school or something like that, And so we used a lot of audio, sound design to give that sense of like, yes, he's hearing things, but it's not just the content of the words that's activating him, and there's an emotional feeling underneath it, like, fear or danger or again, doom. So, one thing that me and Lawrence did was in prep we created well, like one of the things like for the psychotic episodes is I wanted it to be as I mean it feels weird to say, but as authentic as possible or like as real as possible for Lawrence so he could act against it, right? It was like it's tricky to tell an actor like, okay, pretend you hear, one person saying something over there, that person saying something over there, that person saying something different over there, and you're trying to like stay in the middle of three conversations. So what we ended up doing was um we in prep we created these audio tracks of different kind of one of them might have been like experimental jazz, one of them was like shouting, one of them was like whispering, and we would make multiple layers of these like sounds and odd and conversations. And then during certain scenes with when he had psychotic episodes, we'd put an earwig in his ear, and so we'd play these tracks while he's performing. It'd be very low volume because it'd be on his ear, so you couldn't hear it in the mic that's recording kind of what's happening in the scene. But we could, but what it allowed, and it's not anything that we end up using in the final film, but what it allowed was like Lawrence to react to, some sort of a sensory, some sort of a actual sound or some sort of actual feeling that he could, you know, react against and work with, rather than just like being in a silent room and saying like, oh, whatever, imagine this person like feels like they're over in that corner or that shadow's moving. These are things that are very difficult, I feel like, for an actor to hold on to. So giving him something really real to react against, I think helped for us to really make that like portrayal of schizophrenia as sort of real as possible.
That is so cool. I didn't know that. That's because I watching it, I was struck by how good of an actor, like
Yeah,
how
he's great though. Yeah, even that's not
great
easy.
and
Yeah.
really nailed. And it's interesting that you're explaining it that way. It definitely does feel like you can still emotionally connect and relate to him because I think when people think of schizophrenia as just like the explosion of like
Yeah.
crazy, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
they're just, someone on the street, someone who's like dehumanized, but
Yeah.
you see this kid kind of just like looking confused and scared
Yeah.
and also not so explosive, but sometimes just like shut down or just, really fixated on things.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. How did you go about his his fascination with mass shootings? I know that it, it's it what they weren't quite. Did he have hallucinations about that? But it seemed that he was like fixated on learning about it. There was a lot
Yeah.
of the mass shootings happening at that time, and we have this whole conversation about mass shootings and it being instigated by people who are mentally ill, so that makes people scared. Like, how did you have to tackle the mass shootings piece?
Yeah, it was a tricky line to walk while we were writing the script, but also while we were making the film and editing, is sort of like we had to, make palpable her fear that he might be dangerous because of her own misunderstanding. We have the therapist saying how most people with schizophrenia are not violent, and if he hasn't exhibited any worrisome behavior, shouldn't be, there's no reason to worry yet. Um, but her own mind, yeah, again, because at the time that this case happened, it was 2015. It was like the rise of mass shootings in America. I think there was like 300 or 400 that year, and it only has grown since. And so, it is one of those things that she grasped onto because it's in the public conversation at the time too, right? Her fear of what's happening and fear of what he might become. And when she starts to see, evidence of it on his phone, that's where her mind goes, and she doesn't hear, what the therapist's saying, that in most cases people with schizophrenia are not violent. Um, and but yeah, in the film we had to do that thing where we had to show her perspective and her fear and make that real, because that's the way you sort of understand why she thinks he might be in danger, or he might do something that might get him, yeah, locked up later, even if it's not like mass shootings, but it's some sort of violence, because of her own misunderstanding of what mental illness is. Um, and and again, it's sort of that thing where her fear of it, getting out, and her fear of like, and even the shame and the isolation that sort of breeds prevents her from gaining that knowledge about what, schizophrenia actually is, or, how people can live with schizophrenia and how what that might look like. I think so much of again, the tragedy of the film is of the story is that she had no way of sort of imagining what a happy and healthy life would be like for him if she wasn't around, that he could live with this condition, or that, her fear of who would take care of him and all that sort of thing took over, and a fear of what he might become, because she also didn't understand the illness. Um, but it is a tricky thing where we wanted to make sure that there was no indication that he himself was plotting or planning any sort of, mass violence, but he was very fascinated with it, and that absolutely was in the article about all the evidence of his fascination with the various mass shooters. So it was absolutely part of like the fear of what he might become. But again, I think at the root of that is like her just misunderstanding of what schizophrenia is, and like that she just has this leap of logic that he could become something like that.
I mean, even me as a psychologist, if I saw my son fixated on mass shootings, and I would be concerned, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
um,
yeah,
what
absolutely.
what did it say in the article about what the fascination, like, how did it manifest? Was it like, I remember in the movie he was like paying attention on the radio or TV. Is that what the article said that he was
I think in the
doing?
article it was similarly. I think it was websites or printouts or article. Like he had saved clippings, I think, of some of the mass shooters, like Dylan Roof. I can't remember if there's actual physical evidence, or they talked about how he was fascinated with it. Yeah, Dylan Roof came up. Um, so it escapes me right now. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was
It was like
made clear that
following.
he
Yeah.
was following it. Yeah.
Wow. Um, Going back to what we were talking about with how you directed Lawrence, I'm curious how it was. Sorry, it was just like I'm having thoughts in the back of my mind about
Sure.
how interesting it is to that. My job is usually like navigating people through their emotions, but coming back to a regulated place, and you have to get them dysregulated and then have to bring them back. It's like there's a lot of motion regulation and management in your
Yeah.
job. And
Yeah.
what does it look like when they can or cannot handle it? And you were saying have some actors have the tools to like deal with those emotions. What have you seen go right or wrong in that process?
Um, it was interesting. I guess I never saw anything go wrong, but I did do a film, and the actress afterwards talked about how when she left set, it was that thing, she didn't know what to do. She played a person battling addiction,
Mm.
and she would have these. intense fights with her her husband on screen, and then call cut, and then she goes in the car to go home. But she would just say how like when she left the set, like she still had that energy around her, and she didn't know how not how not to be like worked up, and people she interacted with, she would just be still in that emotional space, and it took her a while to figure out how to come down from that whenever she had these really intense days. And I think there there's very experienced actors who can just turn it on and then put it away, or find a way to to generate it, and then I guess store it away like for later, or deal with it somehow. And so yeah, I've never witnessed anything actually happening, but that story did stick with me because she just talked about how she would leave set and just be, if she had this fight scene, she would just be angry, at everybody around her, like she it just generated, and she didn't know how not to be in that space, until she got some sort of catharsis or something. Um, and so yeah, it was it's definitely yeah, it was definitely something I was fearful of when we hired Lawrence, because and we talked about that. We had like very, conversations with him, like this is going to be intense, because we're gonna you know like a psychotic episode, we're gonna do like 5 takes at one angle, change the angle, maybe do another 5 takes that angle. So you're gonna be in that space for hours, right? It's not just like a one-time thing, or even like a few minutes a day. It's like you're gonna have to generate it and be back in it, and there's times where we had to build up to it. Maybe it wasn't extreme enough, like the first take. And that's part of the filmmaking, and part of the acting of it is like we rehearse it and you try it out, and if it's not quite there, and then we just talk about where it needs to be and how to get there. And you know with Lawrence, it was great because we were always talking about yeah, I mean there was so much emotional backstory that anchored sort of like his fear and his torment. um, I think so much of what drives Joe's terror in the film is that things are being taken away from him, right? His father was taken away from him. He starts to see that the store, he grew up with, she might sell it and it might be taken away from him. Finds out his mom is sick, and so she might be taken away from him. So is this thing about protection, right? Is this thing about wanting to protect the family and hold on to things they have. And because it's such a, it's such a primal sort of thing, right? Especially for a small boy to see these things taken away and to react against that, that we could always sort of return to that when we were talking about what this scene was in the copy store, when he has a psychotic episode there, or at school where he thinks he hears his mom. um, and so even if that's not explicit for the audience, for us it's how we sort of like talked about it with me and Lawrence sort of talked about it, so that we could make it very emotionally grounded what he was going through. you
Mhm.
know as-
That's interesting.
yeah.
Gosh, how do you even, I'm just picturing having to do multiple takes and keeping that person in there for several hours. Do you do you have to, besides for the auditory cues that you did, do you have to like ramp them up and keep them? Do you just go, okay, be scared of this, or like how do you? I'm just imagining like having to work with the emotional waves of a person. Like,
Yeah, yeah, and it's a lot of it is sort of like sketching out the circumstances before we start the scene. Like, when he's in the copy store, sort of, towards the end, um, it sort of builds up in the scene before, but then once we are in the copy store, it's sort of like full blown.
yeah.
And so we have to, before we roll cameras and while we're rehearsing, or while they're setting up the camera, me and him are talking about where he was before that, and
Mm,
trying to get back to that. And or it's what's actually happening is we shot the copy store before we shot the scene in the house where he goes through the thing before the copy store. So
mhm.
anyways, we of course it's filmmaking, so we're doing things backwards. So we have to talk about, we have to paint basically an image. And for me it's all about sort of painting that image for him of where he's coming from, and what has to arrive so that when he enters the scene he's already at like whatever 10 or 9
Yeah.
on the dial. um and what does he have to do off screen? Like we might go through sort of an exercise before he comes even, before we even roll the camera, or like we're ready with the camera, you know, me and him might go through something, to build him up to that point and then roll the camera, and then he'll walk out. And like either we're going through like the previous scenes, or we'll read through the previous scenes, or he'll act out the previous scenes, even though we're not rolling the camera on that scene. And then once he enters, the copy store, then we start that part of the scene. But it's like, yeah, ramping him up. Whatever, my job as a director was to find out anything I could do to get him to that space of where he needed to be when we shot it. Even though like we weren't to shoot the preceding scene for like another week, or something like that, So it was, and it's also like, since we don't know what that scene was, it's imagination of like what, we think he'll be at before that scene. So yeah.
What is it like for you? I mean, that to have to emotionally get someone somewhere and then also have to probably have like a whole, eyes on your whole team of production behind you and the like what was that like for you? Would you just lock in or would you be
I
like
would lock in. It's huh. Well, I guess I would say that my experience as a cinematographer helped in that case, because I'm used to trying to be creative under pressure. Because
Mm,
part of a cinematographer's job is the schedule, so I'm like super aware of like um, what it means when we take too long. Um, but also how to stay, I've had that practice. Like I've worked with a lot of first time directors, and I think that's something that can be a challenge, is if you're not used to like the machinery of filmmaking, standing around watching you as you're trying to get this thing. But as a director, it is very easy on set to lock into the thing you need, and maybe, much to the producers and assistant directors' chagrin, because you see the thing that you need, um, and you're trying to figure out ways to make it efficient. So like when we're setting up, usually like after we block a scene, there's sort of a long setup, and I'm using that time to rehearse with the actor. And like me and Lawrence are talking about, me and Lawrence are going through where we think everything is, and I was lucky to have like rehearsal time with Lawrence, and I broke the script down myself, sort of like I think I broke it in like 5 levels of where I thought he would be in terms of his psychosis, and where it gets worse. So, because I knew we would be shooting out of order, so just to keep it straight in my mind, I had to know within the story that he's sort of here, because on the call sheet it shows up as like scene number 75, but I needed to know, exactly sort of where in the trajectory of the story that he would be, in his emotional state. Um, and so that's something we talked about in rehearsal. It's sort of like where we, sort of like that journey, and where, we went over sort of like key scenes and where he would be within those key scenes emotionally on that journey. So it was a lot of sort of like plotting out and remembering where we thought that he would be at. And, Lawrence is such an intelligent actor, and so tapped into the emotionality of it, that it was easy to just sort of like talk about the circumstances, right? And be like, this, you just saw your mom do this, this is what you are fearful of what's happening next. Um, and then we would start to work within like sort of the nooks and crannies of that dynamic, to mine it deeper. But, you know, we could sort of like talk about the circumstances very easily, and he would understand sort of like the space he needed to be. It was never like, oh no, you're way off, man. Why are you smiling? Why are you laughing? Like he knew where he had to be. But it was sort of like how to make it more specific. And there would be times where it'd be more about, don't rush. Yeah, don't rush. Being this moment of fear, or this moment of terror, or this moment of reacting. It's more like slowing down and like saying like, take that in, and then work with that. So it is recognizing sort of like the smaller nuances of his emotionality, and making sure that we capture that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
That's so thoughtful. That's so I mean, it's
Tried.
it's funny because my husband used to be in like documentary filmmaking and stuff
Ah,
like that. I just never appreciated like how much emotional control or manage like it's like it's almost like you have to orchestrate these feelings to come and go. What why would it be why what I'm confused about not being in this field is why would it be a skill to shut it off, even though there's like Daniel Day-Lewis, there's these like it's it's glorified to
Oh yeah.
be in the character for like the entire time you're in the shooting the movie. Is that different to like, I don't know, go method and just stay in the emotion or
It's interesting. Yeah, I've worked with directors or with actors who have sort of tried to stay in character the whole time, or who have stayed in character the whole time. I shouldn't say tried. Um, and it's definitely in terms of your style
better
of
for
working.
you to shoot? Like, just to, oh, he's still there. Like, let's, or is this kind of a mess so that you have like a person who's,
I mean, yeah, I think it's about how people like to work, and I think a lot of it also is just if they have like the emotional stamina to do what they need to do. You know, like I think if someone can exist in that character for 12 hours a day and then, go into some really intense scene and still be in that character and still be a person after you leave set. There's certainly actors who can do that and who are amazing. Um, and but I think it's like, for something like this with Lawrence, given that it was his first role, that was just something that, we really wanted to make sure that he um, could could deal with what he was like portraying or what he was giving on screen and come down from that, or um, not live with it and continue to live with it. But yeah, I think it really just depends on the actors, because I think some actors really savor that, that they can be in this character and just continue to be in that space and that whatever it is, style of talking or behaving, that they never have to break that. But I think for some actors too, I can see that it can help them to put it away, and
Mhm.
like to be able to generate it, because some things are just so intense, and like personally, I don't know how you could walk around all day and live with that sort of like feeling without having to do something about it. Yeah,
Yeah. Wow, that's so fascinating.
yeah,
I wanted to ask you about the last scene, even though I'm gonna try not to give too much away. It just is the last few minutes of or the last third of the movie was just so powerful and stuck with us. And what I thought was actually watching it, we were just in shock. We were just like, I can't believe that movie is over now. and and you and Lucy were doing the Q&A, and she was talking about that last scene and started to cry. And then we all started weeping. And ever since then, my husband and I have thought about that moment in the Q&A and in the movie.
yeah. I mean, it's God. I'm trying to think about how we. It was always. I mean, on the schedule, it was always this massive thing that we had talked about, because we knew it was going to be such a difficult scene, and we wanted to put it towards the end of the schedule, because we knew like once we did it, we had no idea could we do anything else that day. It would be just such a massive thing performance wise for Lucy. Um, and we talked early on about how her walk back from the car had to be like the longest walk possible. It had to be so completely difficult and so like unimaginable. Um, and but what it had to be also though was a way of like sending. Well, I don't know how to talk about this also without giving it away.
Not gonna cut out the details.
Okay. Um, in so many ways is like a farewell, right? And how to do that properly. Eh, how to make this a proper send off, I guess, or a proper goodbye. It's not like she would leave takeout containers on the on the table. It's not like it would be a dirty room. It's not like it's her saying goodbye. So um, the weight of it was always apparent to us. It was always something we knew, and you know in retrospect, I didn't think about doing it any other way. But when we shot Lucy, we had two cameras on her, because she also didn't know how she would react. She like we talked about it. She's like, I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to behave like after I do it. It's just it's to her, she also didn't know what it would be. Um, and I was like, yeah, yeah, like let's just go for it, and we'll be ready for anything. And I had um I had Lawrence lying on the bed though for her, and it didn't occur to me till someone asked later, like, uh, if he was even there. But I always I always like knew that when we'd shoot it, he'd be there, and I think that made it so much harder for her, right? And in the best way, unfortunately, right? It's like she had to look at her son, who she's been playing against, and we shot this towards the end of the film, um, and try to do this thing, and it was very, very, yeah, it was very difficult for Lucy to do it. We only have one take of that scene, because it was so intense, and um, confronting that moment was not easy, and we really had to like talk about it and spend the time on it, and make sure that we were ready for it, because um, we were ready to do other takes that we needed to, but in the shooting of it, like Lucy gave everything in that scene. I mean, like completely undone, and as we didn't need anything else. It was like incredible. But talking about how to actors can put it away, like she was so emotional. Like even after we called cut, like I had to go over and hold her, for like 10 minutes, because she was so, you know, in that moment, and what she had to summon to do the things she did, even though it's not, even though it's not a reality, was so real to her though, and you feel that on the screen and on the camera and at the monitors. We felt that in the room. It and that's the emotional truth we're going after. But it's a testament to Lucy's skill that she could bring that. But it wasn't an easy moment, and we knew that from the beginning. We knew how difficult it would be, and so we were always scheduling it towards the end of the shoot.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah, I know. I know.
thinking about it. Um, what do you what what is it like to get this movie out into the world? I mean, to first of all, we're experiencing it now, where it's like, how do we talk about a movie? We can't really talk about what the actual impact is, like the
Yeah.
actual what happened. But what are you hoping for the reactions of people? Like, how has it been received? I know that it's out January 9th, but it's
Mhm.
that you've had some screenings. What have been the reactions? What is it like to see it out in the world now?
I mean, it's been amazing. Like, when we were editing it, this is something me and Joe Krings, our editor, were conscious of. Like, we just don't know how people would receive it, like what kind of baggage they would bring to it, how they felt about Irene, how they felt about Joe, mental illness, gun violence. There's so many ways to lose the audience, is what we were afraid of, right? Um, and it's been very heartening that people have responded to it, and our screenings, like festivals, and we did a short qualifying run in New York and LA. um, like people have been open to having the conversation about it, which has been amazing, or like welcoming it, um, and that's what we hoped. We hoped this film would start conversations, and at our Q&As, like it happens, like people would be sharing stories, room full of strangers, they'd be sharing stories, and it helped encourage other people to share their stories. And even on set, we were in LA shooting, and there'd be a crew member who came to me and was like, we were filming in, sort of giving something away, and he said, like, oh, we did this a few months ago for my friend, who has mental illness, who disappeared, and us and a bunch of our friends had to go around looking for him. And so even the act of shooting it was encouraging people to share these stories, and that was incredible on set. The one of the locations we shot at, the owners, I think part of the reason they said yes to us using their space is because their son had schizophrenia. And we talked about it when we were scouting, and we were describing the scenes to them, and they completely related, and I think it helped them feel seen and feel like their stories was worth being heard. Um, so it was and so that's happened also, since we've been screening, and we've screened, around the country, and that's what's been very heartwarming, is that people have been open to having that discussion and been wanting it, and have been appreciating that people appreciating that the story's been told, and shining light on people who are caring for those with mental illness, um, and the difficulties of it, and the challenges of it, and how is not just logistics. It's like, yeah, again, all those things about culture and shame and stigma that and isolation that can come about.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting what you said in the beginning, which is like this is a very hyper specific story. I mean, it's one person story. It's Chinese immigrant family, schizophrenia, things that you would think are pretty rare, but yeah, it does tap into a lot of people's experiences. So it's might be surprising like how many people can actually relate to elements of the movie.
Yeah, yeah, it's been surprising to us and just we've had just amazing conversations, like this one too, where we were able to talk about it with people and people will come up after screenings and share their stories and hopefully they'll be more willing to share their stories, with people around them. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Last question is what's next for you? Are you going to direct more? Are you going to go back to cinematography? Are you going to
Yeah, I don't know. This film has been like the focus of my life for a long time. So it's hard to think about the next project. I would love to direct again, but again, the reason I did Rosemead is because it was felt like such a personal connection. I felt like such a personal connection to the story, and so I hope I can find something else that calls to me like that. But I'm certainly interested and open to it. But yeah, I'm also happy to keep shooting because I really enjoy cinematography as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Tell us where we could see the movie or reach out to you or any links or places where the audience can go to after this.
Yeah, maybe the easiest place or the place that we share most information about the film is on our Instagram, at Rosemead Film, all one word. Yeah, we're constantly posting about where the film will be screening or special events. But yeah, it opens this weekend, January 9th, nationwide. So look for it.
That's so exciting. And it's a limited release, right? Or is
Yeah, it's a
like
limited release. Select theaters. I think we're in like 24 cities or something like that. So not everywhere, but a lot of places.
that's exciting. So everyone go see it. So good and so oh like that's all I could say is oh. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining us. This was a wonderful conversation. I really admire what you did with this movie. So I really appreciate all that you've done and coming on and talking
Oh,
about it.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks for supporting the film and be wanting to talk about it. I appreciate it.
All right, little helpers. So if you can, if it's coming out in theater near you, go check it out. January 9th, Rosemead. And we'll see you next week. Thanks so much. By accessing this podcast, you acknowledge that the host of this podcast makes no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information purposes only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial, informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of any medical or any professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The host does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast. And information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement. Thank you.